Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome to the show. I'm Fiorella, and obviously, there's so much going on as usual in terms of the Israel Palestine, the Israeli genocide on in Gaza. Let's just right off the bat say that. I wanted to bring on another guest to discuss more about these iterations that are coming from both the left and the right, saying that these protests are not legitimate, that they are funded by George Soros, and that they're really not important because they won't amount to much of any change. Now, there's so much to discuss with that. I discussed a few days ago with Nico House on this entire topic, as well as just the differences between this and perhaps the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot to discuss in terms of that because we were present during that time, and I covered that on the ground largely with my co-host of the Combo Couch, Pasta. And I want to first begin by what's been going on in US government before I bring on our guest to discuss all of this, because this has been just really frustrating to see coming from this side of the world and seeing how America has gone down the drain, which is something we've been discussing a lot. And not just economically, but also in terms of the structure of the government. There's just chaos, there's division. And we just saw, of course, the US normalizing this Zionism. Jamie, if you can bring on the tweet, I'll just start off by reading it. 320 to 91 Congress House representatives passed a bill to mandate the education department to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism when enforcing federal anti-discrimination laws. That was 187 Republicans and 133 Democrats who voted yes, while only 21 Republicans and 70 Democrats voted no. And I think this is just clear that both the Democrats and the Republicans agree on enabling Zionism. This isn't about anti-Semitism. We have seen Jewish students be attacked by other Zionist entities, whether it's students or non-students, and we've seen the police's reaction to this, which is not surprising to me because I've seen it many times. And you can just hear, you can just play it, Jamie. Look at that. They are basically making Israel the victim yet again. Israel, who, by the way, is committing a genocide on Palestinians in Gaza. This is not up for debate. The majority of the entire world agrees with this. We have seen it live on our phones, on television screens, on computer screens. We have seen the evidence of these mass graves with children and people with their hands tied behind their backs, with their organs missing, completely unjustified violence. Even if you were to justify it by saying Hamas was there or there were terrorists there, apart from that, I witnessed myself the harassment in the apartheid situation happening in the West Bank, which cannot be forgotten because this is an area where Israel is looking to completely control next. And if you look at pictures of what Gaza was 10 years ago, you can see the difference between that and what it is now. And it is absolutely possible for them to continue to do this because that is their entire reason for existing. Now, I think that many on the right and the left, as I mentioned before, have sort of been, in a way, understandably, there has been a lot of lies promoted via George Soros and his foundation. And also the fact that the BLM protests were found to be corrupt. And just some background on that, if you didn't know, Patrisse Cullors basically funneled a lot of the money that was raised from the national chapter to buy herself a house and make herself rich. And that actually did happen. However, when these protests were going on, there were a lot of other things happening in terms of the different groups that were coming out, the different people that were going out and protesting. It wasn't for that reason. They didn't know all of this. They didn't even know who she was. It was mostly just people that agreed with the political statement. Then the Democratic Party came in and started sending out groups to get them to vote for Joe Biden. These things happen. This is a very American way of protesting, and it's a very US American way things get co-opted. So it's no surprise that people are a little bit jaded and think, oh, perhaps George Soros is in this because this is happening at a bunch of liberal universities like Columbia and UCLA, where you have a ton of these, what many call woke kids and woke ideology. But if we discuss the idea of wokeism, you could easily say the right is also woke in their emphasis on these issues as well. Whether it's trans issues, they're extremely focused on that. Whether it's racial issues and trying to say that they don't exist at all, they're extremely focused on that. And when it comes to anything that is Middle Eastern, they tend to have a very, very prejudiced view of that. And that is undeniable. Or anything related to any sort of racial discussion, it simply is a liberal woke argument. There's no room for nuance in discussing these things. And that's primarily my issue here, is that there is no room for nuance. There is no room to have these discussions. And in one thing that I can say there is no room for nuance is the fact that what Israel is doing is wrong and that it is a genocide. Now, there have been many people online who are primarily huge channels that have come out of nowhere, that garnered a huge rise out of nowhere and weren't around for these protests from before. And frankly, probably haven't attended them now from what I've seen. And so they are saying that, no, they know for sure that these protests are completely funded by George Soros because certain people aren't allowed to speak, because these are a bunch of leftist social justice liberals. And so therefore these protests must be corrupt from behind. But does that mean that the entire movement is false or that it will amount to nothing? Is there a legitimate concern about all of this? So let's discuss now, before we bring in our guests, this article. And I want you to look at this article as well, because this is an article from the New York Post. If you guys recall, the New York Post was the outlet that was censored by Twitter, or X, Twitter at the time, for putting out this story about the Hunter Biden laptop. And they cried censorship and they said that this was awful. And in spite of all of that, you have the reality that they are doing the same thing. They continue to censor people. They continue to completely deny these people the ability to have protests. So actually, let's just go ahead and discuss this with Don. Don, can you just come on in? Let's bring up Don. Don DeBar is a radio host. He is also the host of, he goes on KPFK. He goes on, he was just here in Moscow, and he is a journalist and a political commentator. Don, if you can just come on and
first, before we bring on Don,
I want to ask you what do you think about the way this is presented as these protests being funded by George Soros?
First, before we bring on Don, let's let people know we're going off of the Combo Couch. And your video is frozen. All right. Folks, I think Fee has had some connection issues. She couldn't hear me. And I think she's fixing her video right now. But if you're watching right now on the Combo Couch YouTube channel, please, right now, click the link in the chat or in the description and switch to Fee's channel, because we are shutting down the Combo Couch live stream, and it's only going to be live stream on Fee's channel. So do that right now while Fee is reconnecting, and we're going to bring on Don and Fee, and you can watch that interview, and we'll discuss this entire topic in full. But you're going to have to watch it on her channel, or you can watch it on Don's channel, because he's also simulcasting it as well. So as soon as she's back, we'll let you know. And I'm just going to put up a card and some music till she comes back.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure where we left off, but I wanted to just go ahead and bring out Don to discuss both of these things. First of all, Don, I don't know if you took a look at the New York Post article that we have
Yes.
here, Jamie. Uh-huh. And basically that article says that all of these protests have some sort of Soros funding because Soros has funded movements like this before, which is true. And a lot of these movements have been on the left. Now, my question to you is, do you really think that that is the case in this instance? And does that mean, even if it is the case, that the entire thing um, is entirely able to be thrown out? Because I honestly haven't seen, and there was a counter article to this that I wanted to bring up, the evidence of the money ties directly and the people who were actually working, that the people that are named in this article that were in charge of these organizations that are supposedly tied to Soros are no longer at the campus at all. So I just want to ask your opinion, first of all, on that main issue.
Well, I mean, I'm amazed that the New York Post has had the time to research this so thoroughly, given that this phenomenon has sprung up over the last few days. I would say it's a record for the Post, at least since Murdoch took over a couple of decades ago, for them to research anything that thoroughly. Generally, the two-headed baby, that kind of stuff, they're able to give you a good solid history on, but the actual news of the day, they're a little weak on doing research. So I don't know who's funding what. You have, for example, counter protests, quote unquote, of pro-Zionist or pro-Israel protesters who have been committing assaults on the protesters at a variety of places. This film, for example, from UCLA from last night, where people were screaming anti-Semitism, throwing spears and other objects at protesters who were holding a sign, Jews for Palestine. Who's the anti-Semite in there, and who's funding whom in that morass? We do know that the police heavily fund all kinds of counter-terrorist groupings. In other words, whenever there's a protest, they've got people in the audience as actors to help direct the outcome of it. If we assume their benevolent intent throughout all of this, what they're doing is seeking to diffuse things. But in fact, we've seen very often what they do is incite them. And so the public is funding some of this. Soros himself, there was an interesting interview that I found in the middle of researching this from 2003, November of 2003. So we're about, I guess, shock and awe was March 20th, I think, of 2003. So 8 months later, and it was for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. You can go to jta.org to see their website. And I'm going to read just a bit from this article. I'll try not to make it too boring. And the title of the article, again, this is the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. In rare Jewish appearance, I don't know what the hell that means, George Soros says Jews and Israel cause anti-Semitism. And the argument is in here, he gets up and speaks and he says, there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe. And again, he's saying this in 2003. Go back and research the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe. Go all the way back to 1946, and you'll see reports of that. This is held out a lot. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but it's commonly held out as being true. There's a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe. The policies of the Bush administration and the Sharon administration, that's Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister of Israel at that time, contribute to that. It is not specifically anti-Semitism, but it does manifest itself in anti-Semitism as well. I'm critical of those policies. Again, the policies of the U.S. and Israel he's talking about. He says, if we change that direction, anti-Semitism will also diminish. I can't see how one could confront it directly. So this article then goes on to say that this is a point made by Israel's most vociferous critics, whom Jewish activists charged with using anti-Zionism as a guise for anti-Semitism. So that's Soros's position on this. And just so you really take this home in terms of its absurdity, as an unintended consequence of my actions, I also contribute to this. He refers back because he says, I'm concerned about my own role because the new anti-Semitism holds that Jews rule the world. And what he's saying basically is that because I do, I'm feeding this anti-Semitism. It's kind of crazy, actually. So Soros has been involved in financing all kinds of discord all over the place. People tend to look at these things in a binary sense, first of all, when it's more three-dimensional than that. Just because I disagree with the policies of the opposition, say, in this country or that, doesn't mean I can't support them if keeping that government off balance gives me a benefit over here where I encounter them on this world stage. And Soros has his hands in so many, and his money, and it's tied to U.S. aid and other money. They leverage each other in so many places that this grand chess game that they talk about, that he's an active player in it. You can see his hand right now in Georgia, in Tbilisi. You can see it in Ukraine. You can see it here in the United States. I don't know what his role is in the thing with Palestine, because we have to go into why it might be useful to globalists, to the elite here, to have a hand on both sides. But the question of whether or not this is a, George Soros financed operation has to consider this point. Is the actual opposition valid on its face? In other words, are the policies being pursued by Israel in Gaza worthy of protest? And are they worthy of protest to the level that we've seen exhibited? And so we first have to ask, well, what are the policies? The government of Israel has stated what the policy is in a variety of different fora, including Netanyahu and his senior officials in the military and the Knesset. The policy is to remove the people of Gaza from Gaza. For many of them, to extinguish the Palestinian people. And we're seeing something, if that's not what we're seeing rhymes with that so well that it would be kicked out of poetry class for being, childish. So then the question is, if you're looking at genocide and or land theft and mass murder, is it appropriate to occupy buildings or otherwise protest in the United States, the place that's funding most of the military operations of Israel? I think that's the question.
Well, and also, again, when Soros funds these color revolutions, like what we're seeing in attempt in Georgia right now, and all sorts of funding that he gives, it's actually for specific reasons of countries that are not complying, of peoples from countries that are not complying with the current narrative. When you're talking about the Palestinian protests, it is college students who really are not in the workforce right now. They're mostly focused on studying. They're not really part of the entirety of society, which is valid, right? They're not out there trying to start an actual workers' revolution. And I think some of the criticism coming from the people that say, well, they're just not going to do anything. Well, they're college students. I mean, what can they do? And at the end of the day, Soros, who benefits most from these attacks on these Palestinians, are the Israelis, the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, all of these people, and mainstream media has been entirely focused on attacking them. Entirely has been the entire time since this began, and before October 7th, they have been focused on painting Hamas and anybody supporting Palestinians as these terrorists. And you've seen that bleed into the description from some of these neocons online and others saying that these kids are terrorists, that they're domestic terrorists, which is funny because that's what we were calling a bunch of Trump supporters protesting the election on January 6th. And lo and behold, a lot of these same people that were crying about being called domestic terrorists are now saying that these college protesters are domestic terrorists. And their protests have been largely completely milquetoast. I mean, if we're talking about comparisons to what the French have done or what protests are like in Latin America and how people protest and do things there and how actual revolutions happen, these protests are not that. This isn't a bunch of communists like many of the neocons are trying to say. It's simply a bunch of college students from various facets of the uh, the political contingent, and they're just against this genocide. They're against their schools supporting this genocide. The main call that I've seen is divestment away from the money going to Israel to fund this genocide. And we've also seen the education of younger people through TikTok. And we are also now seeing, of course, the attempt to ban it and the approval by Biden to ban TikTok and try to censor as much of this content as it is possible when it comes to anything that might be deemed anti-Semitic. But the reality is the Palestinian people are Semitic people. And nobody really talks about that fact. They don't exist in the quadrant of being Semitic peoples. And so it's interesting to me that we're immediately, as these protests have garnered national and international media attention. I mean, we're talking about these protests all the way in Russia. We're talking about these protests in China. You're talking about these protests all over the world. The moment they garner immediate international attention and recognition, and people are seeing what is being done to the protesters by police and by others who are supporting the Zionist entity, that's when people start turning on the protesters and say, well, we got to discount it because there's Soros money here. And nobody has been able to present the connection to the Soros money. I want to look at this counter argument very quickly. And this is titled, Are the Pro-Palestine Campus Protests Being Funded by George Soros? A Closer Look. And you guys can go read this article, therundownlive.com. And it basically goes over everything we went through. There's a specific paragraph I'll just read here. It says, the records indicate, and this is referring to the New York Post's expose article, 3 donations to education for just peace in the Middle East, totaling 700,000 between 2018 and 2022. 4 donations to Jewish Voice for Peace, totaling 875,000 between the years of 2017 to 2022. And as for the Students for Justice in Palestine, the supposed money trail is convoluted, with donations allegedly going from the Open Society Foundation to the Tides Foundation, and then to the Westchester People's Action Coalition Foundation, or Westpac, and finally to the SJP. But it's interesting because despite all of this, there is no actual direct connection. There is no actual evidence to actually know that the money trails, so to speak, right? Because you got to follow the money. And there really isn't an actual direct connection. And so you can say that, oh, because of the makeup of these students, that they could be liberal, that they could be on the left, that they could be, blue-haired and support trans and be on that side of the agenda, that you can discount it. But you really can't do that, because then you're being biased as to and trying to gatekeep as to who can protest and how they should protest. Let me ask you, Don, isn't this a very American way of protesting? Like, isn't it like tradition at this point that in the United States, every single protest movement gets co-opted or completely dismissed one way or the other?
Well, look, you can look at the history of protest in the United States and elsewhere and try to ascertain what it springs from, what are the conditions that give rise to it. For example, in a society where everyone's housing, food, education, medical care, etc., was secure, and their continued access to this was secure, you don't see so much energy in an issue that might not, in essence, some things get energized much more intensively than they would otherwise. These things take place in a soil with a particular political and social pH, for lack of a better word or term. And people here, the students, look at them. First of all, part of the trope here is that, in fact, they're not students. Some are dropouts. Some are never went to school kids. They're all of that age, but they're on the periphery of society or whatever. There's masses of them. Guess what? The condition of that generation is that shaky, that they're waiting for something because they have no future, they have no hope, and their means for survival today is in question. You have millions of people in eviction and foreclosure. You have a huge amount for even a moderate income country of food insecurity across the board, unprecedented in this country, even during the Depression. You have, perhaps World War III brewing here, genocide on television over there. This is, by the way, a generation that has up to its point is the most nurtured and socialized on media of any in history, just like the one before was, and the one before was, and the ones subsequent are being. That seeing something on YouTube is more real to them than it is to someone that was socialized person to person or through a television, because they spend more time there and less time actually engaged in the world. And where they're educated on how to use analytical skills, critical thinking skills, classic education, humanities, social sciences, these things are not widely distributed or absorbed anymore. And so these people they know their situation sucks, to use a clinical term, and they see no way out, no daylight on the other end of it. They're seeing these images that should inflame them. And because of the mode of delivery and the mode of their socialization, inflame them more than they might inflame you or I. And they don't have the critical skills to look at it, to know, how do I deal with this? This is what's going to happen. Now, let's take any picture of confrontation on any of these college campuses right now. Student protesters, student counter-protesters, whichever side you want to ascribe that to, and the police. Suppose each of them had a little sign on saying where their funding came from. Yeah, you're going to see some from Soros. You're going to see some from the Koch brothers. You're going to see some from taxpayers. You're going to see some from the CIA. For example, the CIA is a taxpayer-funded agency. Does that tell you anything about its mission? And so this is a pat way of dismissing these protesters to a segment of the audience. A different line of nonsense, a different narrative is being sold to each subset of the marketplace out here. I would call it the marketplace of ideas if there were any ideas involved. The audience of the New York Post wants to hear that Soros and the communists are funding this. The New York Post calls Joe Biden a communist. George Soros, one of the most successful anti-communists in the history of the world, if you look at his role in taking down the Warsaw Pact, for example. So, I'd like to go to the actual law that the Congress passed, because I think this says everything. This is what they passed yesterday. Access to provide for consideration of a definition of anti-Semitism as set forth by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for the enforcement of federal anti-discrimination laws concerning education programs or activities and other purposes. And so it cites at the head end of it that they're doing this under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. That was the purpose of the law they amended. Now, the essence of it is to allow an outside group, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, to fix the definition for the purposes of enforcement of that. What constitutes a violation? And they add anti-Semitism, first of all, which was not in the statute. And then they say anti-Semitism is constituted by this, and that's what's going to be plugged in from the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Well, and then that, because they say this is anti-Semitic, whatever it might be wearing a purple hat is anti-Semitic. If they say so, federal agencies now cannot fund if you're wearing a purple hat. This is an awful lot of authority to delegate to a private party.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're doing is delegating it in this case, where, for example, they wouldn't delegate to Louis Farrakhan definitions of racism, which actually, on the basis of race and color, are in the statute. And you could arguably say, I think legitimately, that as bad as the situation of Jewish people may or may not have been in the history of the United States, that of black folks who were dragged here from Africa and enslaved for a few hundred years and strung up and still populate the prisons and everything else and ghettos and unemployment lines and everything else at a rate 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times everyone else, that they might be entitled to have someone set a definition of what is discrimination against them until their lot was on a par with everyone else. I would say let's go to black neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods. Let's look at the Jewish and black populations of schools. Go across the board. This is not a trope against Jewish people, but this is an analysis of what the Congress just did yesterday, that Hakeem Jeffries and the whole lot of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Progressive Caucus and a lot of those lying bastards, nobody uttered any of this, and that's at the core of it. So we can talk about Soros if you want. This is what happened yesterday.
No, this is what we showed in the beginning before we lost connection. And again, this is extremely important because I have never seen any other group of people get away with committing a genocide and going and bombing an embassy, completely breaking the Vienna Convention, international law, and then also get to call themselves victims and also affect legislation in the United States via a private group. So this means that the American people, in case you didn't know already, are not governed by their own government, and which is not accountable to them, but they're also governed by private entities and private corporate groups that basically can do whatever they want because they're private groups. This is a completely outside group. This has nothing to do with the government. And yet Jewish voices via this legislation are able to control what our country, our government deems as anti-Semitic. Now, does this cause more anti-Semitism? Well, yeah, because of course, because how could it not? I mean, how are they allowed to have this much power? And this is why so many people go to the Jews control the world. This is what they say, and this is what they think, because they see this happening and they're like, well, what else could it be? The reality is that the United States needs Israel because Israel is its military control in the region, and its intent is to have Israel expand its control beyond Palestine, beyond Gaza, into the West Bank, into Lebanon, into Syria, into the entire Middle East and West Asia, just like the United States and NATO have expanded pretty much everywhere else. The problem is that the entire world is seeing this now and they're responding to it. And I think the important thing in regard to what's happening is to allow people to have access to the information, especially young people, because in college it's a time to protest, it's a time to make mistakes, it's a time to really garner so much information that you possibly can. And that's what's happening right now via social media. You said it yourself, Don. This age of social media allows them to get access to all of this information in a short amount of time. The problem is the establishment is threatened by that because they can no longer brainwash people the way they used to, the CNN way, the MSNBC way. So what they're doing is they're causing the access to these applications to be tarnished with paid influencers who are advocating for Biden or advocating for Israel or advocating for something else to push controlled opposition, like elements in the squad, right? You see AOC taking a photo with Biden one day, and then you see her going to a protest saying, I stand with the Palestinian people, yet she voted for the Iron Dome. You have controlled opposition in all areas, not just in government, but also in media and independent media and the internet. So all of this is happening because they figured out, hey, we can't continue to brainwash people in the original way we were doing it. So now what we have to do is promote ourselves into these agendas of both ends of the spectrum, the anti-Palestinian and the pro-Palestinian sectors. And what that ends up doing is it ends up creating chaos and destroying movements like they've been destroyed time and time again since before the civil rights movement and around that time. There is no movement in anti-war in the United States because there's not a movement allowed. It basically becomes infighting and people criticizing each other and nothing ever gets built up. But the reality is these kids aren't here to build a revolution. They're here still to learn about it, to try to do what they want to do. They have said their demands very clearly. They have demands. They want their schools to divest from Israel, from funding Israel. That's it. And that's their demand. I would hope that the people that are actually in the workforce that are seeing their tax dollars go to tanks being displayed by Russia at Victory Park here in Moscow, that are going to fund Zelensky's new house, that are going to kill kids in Gaza. I hope those people that understand that are the ones that are going to lead and create movements, because the United States, as you said it in the beginning, Don, is falling apart. It is collapsing, and there should be something founded there to bring some sort of change. But right now, all I see is just, unfortunately, a bunch of chaos. And I think that what are these protests going to achieve? Right? That's the question. What are they going to achieve? Are they going to achieve anything? What do you make of that? What do you think they're going to achieve? And is it their job to achieve something more than whatever their demand is at this point?
We could do like 5 2-hour programs fleshing out each of the things you were just talking about. There's a lot in there. I just want to clarify something before I answer that from what I said before. The ethnicity of the people who passed this legislation and of the people who are organized around these issues is incidental. If you look, for example, at the phenomenon around casinos in the United States, you've had the almost extermination, certainly the mass murder and genocide of the native peoples in North America, at least north of the Rio Grande. And the confinement in reservations and the deculturization, all the horrible things that were done and have been or are being done. Leonard Peltier's still in prison, for example. Suddenly the question, and these lands are neglected totally, that these people live on for a couple of centuries now, in some cases. Suddenly, regulatory issues arise when, I don't know if you say the mafia expresses its policy through the government, when casinos are beginning to be licensed outside of Las Vegas and Reno, outside of Nevada, in various parts of the United States, which happened over the 70s, 80s, 90s, and current period. All of a sudden, Native Americans had legitimate claims to land that happened to be prime land for casinos. And these people who were the victims, in fact, upon whose necks the state was built here, are suddenly allied with the state. They have state power helping to clear out their claims because their land claims have sovereign immunity. Basically, they're sovereign as against American law. We do, in fact, respect your nationhood. We've never respected it until today, but today we respect it because that means our zoning and our state constitution's prohibitions against gambling and all that crap don't apply to your land, and we can build a great big casino. You can own it. We're going to pay you $50 a month rent for it. We're going to let your kid work in the casino. Maybe your daughter hook one of the hotels, but we're going to let this happen. That's the kind of stuff that they do when they play with ethnicity from place to place to place. It's to benefit this beast that sucks everybody's blood. If you look in the trenches, with the debris of the working class, as many people in there as not are Jewish, and a lot of them have a strong history of defending the rights of workers. And so I don't want to even imply that this has anything to do with being Jewish. This is a mechanism whereby you can privatize the government regulation of funding, cloaking it in some bullshit human rights language, and ride the back of that to support a policy of genocide and war that's being conducted in the name of the same people. The confluence of Judaism and Zionism happens for a purpose. And this is one of the manifestations of it. And this is one of the products of it. And this is one of the intended products of it. So we got to be very clear how we talk about these things. And I wanted to make sure that in any event, that's how I'm talking about it. As far as what was the last part of that? Because that's what I wanted to answer first.
Well, no, I was just saying, is it the job of these protesters to really do much more than what they have said their demands are? For example, they're being criticized for they're not going to go anywhere. These protests don't help Palestine and the resistance in any way. And first of all, no international law has helped Palestinians. None of these things happening with the ICJ and all of that have actually really helped Palestinians in the way that the resistance has helped Palestinians. Let's be clear on that. That's not going to happen.
Let me frame this way. And so you're seeing, in essence, the same thing we saw at the Security Council last week, and we've seen repeatedly for decades, going back to 1967, and also in the General Assembly. The bulk of humanity stands up and says, look, this is what's supposed to happen. Israel is illegally occupying all of this land. You're violating the human rights of the people that belong there and a whole lot of other people in the process. Stop. And every time a head count is taken on that, where the United States, where it comes to the Security Council finally for action, the United States vetoes it, or they tell Britain or France to veto it. They can't veto the students, and so they veto them with psyops, with propaganda and obfuscation and bullshit, and with billy clubs and with tear gas. And so, I've been on the business end of that. I've tasted tear gas, and I've seen what they do, how a peaceful protest is attacked by police on horseback, tear gas canisters being thrown at them, etc., where they're not really impeding anything but the convenience of some section of the message is stop. And so they don't have a veto, so this is their veto. As far as what the students are supposed to do or know or whatever, look, revolutions don't happen. Every person that'll tell you they're a revolutionary, not every, but many folks who will tell you that they're a revolutionary, and some, because some very good people have done this also, but some that'll put it as like their occupation or whatever, will tell you that there is someplace a cookbook Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. Also, the psychotic right or whatever, the opposition to the paranoia about a revolution will also impute to revolutionaries that they've got this revolutionary cookbook. You've got actually published the anarchist cookbook, to this cookbook, to that. So there's this idea that there's some formula that you have to sit down, pull out if people still have a slide rule or a calculator or some app on their phone now or whatever, and it's going to say, okay, step 1, call your friends. Step 2, meet down at Bob's. Step 3, hold up signs that say BDS. Step 4, throw an apple at the police, whatever. That ain't how it works. What happens is people are shaken out of their comfort zone generally by a rapid or endemic deterioration of their situation to where their survival feels challenged. And when that happens, it's like if you made a certain sound, maybe inaudible, but of a certain frequency to agitate people in an auditorium or rats in a laboratory or whatever, it's like a constant source of irritation. So they're on edge all the time over this. I can't sleep. I'm going to be evicted. My kids are hungry. My kid is going to get kicked out of school because I can't make the tuition payment. Whatever, I'm hungry. Whatever it is, that condition gives rise to looking up and saying, this ain't right. I got to do something about it. Now, we are not all trained, in revolutionary theory, sociology, law, political science, psychology, propaganda, marketing, whatever. We come to this with whatever we know how to do. I fix shoes. I'm a car mechanic. I sell insurance, whatever. And now I'm in this condition. I go to look to have a conversation with other people in the same condition. I go to the social media. For a while, I'm finding people like that. Then after a little while, they're disappearing, and I'm talking to nobody, and I'm getting all kinds of ads with naked girls in it or whatever. I'm feeling what Marx described 200 years ago, almost, as alienated. So it's a psychiatric phenomenon too, by the way. Psychosis, as a matter of fact. So this is what you stagger into action with. There are people that are trying to organize. I'm one of 100 tenants in a building, for example, and we're all facing, or a lot of us are facing, terrible problems. Some people, either organizers from outside who have done other buildings, or someone in the building hears about it or just learns to do it and goes around and organizes this so people start talking to each other in person and understand that we all have this common problem. And then they start sharing their experiences to come up with some ideas on how to solve them. Then there are tactics that are in play, strategy, maybe formulas, but at least some tactic. Let's try this and see what happens. And so they protest out in front of the building. Maybe when that doesn't work, they stop traffic in front of the building. Maybe they march down to ABC, NBC, CBS studios in Manhattan, whatever. If that doesn't go anywhere, and they keep experimenting. This has been an ongoing part of human social evolution since the beginning. But certainly, if you look at this type of protest in the United States, at least since the 19th century, 18th century, the Boston Tea Party was like this in a way. So what happens when these things germinate into actual social movements is kind of like a spontaneous combustion within a controlled environment, where this is the only, or one of the only, outcomes that could have happened from this thing, because all of the other ones lead to a dead end. Now, this sounds kind of theoretical, and I'll try to make it real now. When these kids, for whatever reason, became aware of the condition of the people in Palestine, decided it was urgent to do something about it, observed that no matter how hard people were pushing on this point, that the government of the United States and Israel were intransigent on it and continued and accelerated, and where the behavior, depending on how closely they're watching, for example, of the United States government in the Security Council, even in the General Assembly, the press conferences, the state and the White House. Watching all of this, some people feel, oh my God, this is a horror happening in front of us. Some of these people, believe the book of Genesis. I'm not Genesis, about Armageddon, the Revelations, have these, Hollywood images of Armageddon, see that this is happening. Whatever it is that adds that energy to it. The fundamentals are their situation is intolerable. They're seeing horrors perpetrated. The institutions are not responsive even to the loudest of demands. And then they assemble together and try to protest in a center of learning where there ought to be teachers leading them in laboratory, and analytical sessions. And instead, they're being repressed. There is a lesson there. There's a lot of lessons. You look at, for example, Kent State and Jackson State in 1970. One lesson there was that the police come on campus, and if they don't like what you're doing, or the National Guard, they shoot you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the lessons learned by the establishment was when you do that, it catalyzes further organizing and pushback. Now, as romantic as that might sound, it still took several years to stop the Vietnam War after Kent State, which is May 4th, 1970. But this is a process that goes on. You look at Russia, the revolution in 1917, because actually the two that were in 1917. That didn't come out of nowhere. There was a revolution in 1905. There was also almost a revolution in 1861 when they freed the serfs. These things, people push back against oppression. Sometimes the whole order collapses because it should. It just doesn't fit circumstances anymore. The production is an entirely different mode. Instead of donkeys pulling plows, we've got microprocessors and whatever. And so this old order of organizing things doesn't work because you can't organize these things that way. So when they push back, it's an empty shell and it collapses. Sometimes the old order is very resilient. And this particular order, as it's falling, has at its disposal more data about each and every human being within its reach, more processing power to crunch and apply that data to their purposes, more processing power to analyze history, to focus the outcome of the work that they're doing, more military power and police power than has ever been assembled in human history. And if you're going to go by the body count, the most sociopathic methodology, nothing is off the table, in other words. They're going to push back hard. And they're feeling it out front right now. We're talking about a manifestation of it because this crap in the New York Post is part of their cloud that they're putting over. They want to cloud our vision so they can, if they have to, kill these kids to shut them up. So what are they supposed to do in these circumstances? They're going to find their way. When we had the Occupy movement, I guess you could call it a movement at its fullest expression, in 2011, the first thing that occurred to me was, if this is really going to be a revolution, because they were taking the form of people's assemblies. After it caught like wildfire. The first week in New York City, within a week or two, it was in 80 some odd cities, and another week it was all over the planet. They were organizing different ways of trying to have conversations among an assembly. Popular assembly is the term that you use, and these resembled what happened in Russia in 1905 and 1917. In fact, people talk about the Soviet Union. Soviet is a council. These are workers' councils that were organized. They were basically assemblies of workers that were organized. That the country was organized on those councils as a way of self-rule. I was thinking it was just 1905 or 1917. Well, looking in the aftermath, maybe it was 1861. But we aren't going to know where we are in the stage of a revolution until it develops, or as it develops, and maybe not even then. You really can't tell until you're looking at it in the rearview mirror. But your role in it It's very difficult because nobody, even the people that imagine themselves to have this objective perspective of these things, has that perspective. And the other side does. They know where we are, what we're saying, who we said it to, what we're, maybe what we're thinking, who knows? And they have the power to confine us electronic. They could pull my plug right now. I'm talking to myself in my basement. Send a car over here and drag me off and park me next to Jimmy Hoffa, whatever. I don't have the power to reciprocate. Those students sure as hell don't. So I don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Neither do they. But, the way humanity develops, they're going to find their way. And it's our job to try to keep the beast off their back while they find their way.
Yeah, and I think it shouldn't all be all on them. I do think that people who have the capacity, the means, the funds to do something should also be helping them instead of just criticizing, which is what a lot of what I'm seeing, not just from the neocons or the New York Post, but from people on the left, supposed left, criticizing them, saying that this is going to amount to nothing. Well, they're not the resistance that they're not claiming to be. I mean, the resistance, the axis of resistance has been doing the work. You have seen Ansarallah, you have seen Hezbollah, you have seen what Iran did. Iran's actions against Israel did more than anything else has done to really showcase the weakness of not just Israel, but of the United States. And the entire popularity of Israel is completely just done. Israel will never be viewed the same again. And that's something that the establishment can no longer fix. They are trying to use this anti-Semitic trope, but the more they do that, the more they alienate people against everybody else under the Jewish mantle. So it's just useless. They've lost this. They've, in spite of everything that's happened in Gaza, they have lost the war on propaganda because their propaganda has been met with reality, and the reality has been showcased to how so many kids were murdered and how we've seen this unfold. And I just think that that is no longer a place where Israel can come back from. And so what we're seeing here is a reaction to that. And I'm hoping that in spite of what we're seeing, the critiques of it, that it does amount to something, that it does amount to more organization. And as these people leave college and as they are introduced into the workforce, they see that there is no future. And I think that is part of it, that there is a decline. There is a sense of complete and total deception in everything you were told. And I sense it because, the millennial generation went through that as well and is going through that as well. We've seen nothing but war. And now you have Gen Z coming in and seeing the same thing. And also on top of that, having access to more technology and just faster technology and faster methods of social media than we had. So it's all coming together to, I think, a tipping point in the United States. So Don, I want to thank you for coming on and having this discussion with me. I know we could talk for hours on all of this. There's so much that goes into this particular discussion, but overall, I think I haven't seen an actual evidence of direct funding. And even if, as you said, there could be funding from Soros, there could be funding from here, XYZ. The reality is that we have to push through that. And these people are really majorly supporting these protests because they see that it's wrong. And I think it's as simple as that. Anything else you want to say? And please also let people know where they can find you.
Oh, yeah. Well, first, thanks a lot for having me, Fiorella. I appreciate it a lot. And I enjoy talking with you. And I wish I got a chance to hang out with you when I came to Moscow. They sent me to Siberia instead, which I enjoyed, by the way, tremendously.
Yeah.
Just to cap what you just said, this is what I was describing, basically. The soil was changing. The soil has changed already. And this is a product of everything that's happened. I don't think we can say who... I don't think we can name or credit any group with what's happening. This is, in essence, the working class college age, kids and allies and others, that this is rebellion, they call it, or protest, and pushing back. There's a million people that'll claim this as theirs, and it belongs to each and every one of them. There are people that agree with this or that thing, that are united in seeing that this Holocaust has to stop, and so we just have to observe it and support it in the ways that we can. The people that are involved in trying to keep it on track, and it will further develop along, hopefully, more beneficial lines. People can reach me on Facebook at Don DeBar, the way it's spelled. How do I point to that thing right there? Yes, okay. And or at Don DeBar, like that, on Twitter. Also on VK, Don DeBar spelled that way, and on Truth Social, the Trump Twitter or whatever it is.
Wow.
And I'm on a number of the same as at Don DeBar, number of other platforms. I have a YouTube page under Don DeBar, and hit me up if you want to chat. I usually respond to my messages. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you're also on the radio, right?
Yeah, I do international news on the afternoon drive time news for KPFK in Los Angeles, Rebel Alliance News.
Awesome. Okay, wanted to make sure they knew that as well. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in today. We'll see you next time. Look out for a video, by the way, I will have up of all that I saw at the May Day festivities here in Moscow. All the Ukrainian tanks, the American Abrams tanks, the NATO tanks with the NATO insignia. All of that was great to see. People were very excited to see it. Russians were very supportive of this display, and they were clearly sending a message. So look out for that. I'll post the entire thing on YouTube, if not tonight, tomorrow morning. So
I was jealous. I looked at some of your video there yesterday. I was jealous. It looked like a beautiful day too. Our tax dollars at work, by the way. We spent about $1 billion so you can parade that tank around Red Square or wherever it is.
Yes. Yes, exactly. That's what I said. Our tax dollars, every time, our tax dollars. And when I spoke English, some people were like excited. They were like, "Oh, like, what do you think of this?" It was interesting to see all of that. So yeah, more of that will be up, and more of course, this week is very important in Russia. We have this week and the next. We have May 9th festivities, and we have a lot going on. So I'll be taking a lot of video for that. So look out for that, and more Palestinian videos as well coming this week. So thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye.
This is Gaza. Please don't look away. In 1948, men with guns chased my grandparents from their village, killing many who stayed, just because of who they were. Those soldiers called it the creation of Israel. My grandma Siti called it the Nakba, the catastrophe. My family wanted to come back home, and the UN said they could. They called that Resolution 194, but it never happened, so I was born here. Gaza is all I've ever known, and more men with guns they call the IDF. They shoot people for protesting peacefully and take my friends to prison for throwing stones. The soldiers don't let us leave, so Gaza is a prison too. The men who built these walls don't want people like me to live together with them in one nation, in peace. That is not right. And now, they don't want us to live at all. Right now, Israel's bombs and guns have displaced 2 million people. The US and President Biden helped them. Our schools, mosques, and hospitals have been destroyed. We are homeless, starving. 77,000 have been hurt. In April, 40,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel, including 15,000 kids, just like me. We are not human shields or collateral damage. We're just scared kids who deserve to live.